In the year 1905, the Russian Empire was a colossal giant, sick and teetering on the verge of collapse. It was a nation humiliated abroad and simmering with revolution at home. The disastrous war against Japan had shattered the myth of its military might, sending shockwaves of dissent from the frozen streets of St. Petersburg to the warm waters of the Black Sea. And in that sea, a new symbol of imperial power floated, a steel behemoth named Potemkin Tavrichesky. A state-of-the-art battleship bristling with guns, it was meant to project the Tsar's unshakable authority. But in a few short days, it would become the most famous mutinous warship in history, its name forever linked not with the glory of the empire, but with the explosive fury of its people. This is the true story of the battleship Potemkin. It is a story of maggots, murder, and massacre. A story of incredible bravery and fatal indecision. And it is a story that was so powerful, it had to be rewritten into a legend, leaving the real, even more fascinating truth buried beneath the weight of cinematic myth. The Potemkin was the pride of the Imperial Black Sea Fleet. Laid down in 1898 and only recently entered into service, she was a pre-dreadnought battleship over 378 feet, 115 meters long with a displacement of nearly 13,000 tons. Her main armament consisted of 4 massive 12-inch guns, capable of hurling devastating shells over 10 miles away, housed in 2 heavily armored turrets, one fore and one aft. 16 6-inch guns lined her sides, ready to spit fire at any lesser vessel that dared approach. She was protected by a belt of Krupp cemented armor up to 9 inches, 229 millimeters, thick and could steam at a respectable 16 knots. On paper, she was a titan, a floating fortress designed to dominate any naval engagement. But a warship is more than just steel and gunpowder. It is a microcosm of the nation that built it, and the Potemkin was crewed by 763 men who were living the Russian Empire's slow-motion collapse in real time. Life for an enlisted sailor in Tsar Nicholas II's navy was a miserable existence. The discipline was brutally harsh, with officers who were often aristocrats viewing the common sailors as little more than animals. The food was poor, the pay was laughable, and the work was dangerous and exhausting. This was made infinitely worse by the news trickling in from the Far East. At the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, just weeks before the mutiny, the Imperial Japanese Navy had utterly annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world only to be sunk. It was one of the most decisive naval battles in history, and a national humiliation of staggering proportions. The men of the Black Sea Fleet, including those on the Potemkin, knew that their training was poor, their leadership was questionable, and their equipment, while impressive, was being wielded by a corrupt and incompetent regime. This feeling of despair created a fertile ground for the revolutionary ideas that were sweeping through Russia. Secret pamphlets were passed from hand to hand in the dim light of the mess decks. Whispers of socialism, anarchism, and democracy filled the cramped sleeping quarters. Among the Potemkin's crew was a small but dedicated circle of revolutionaries, men like the charismatic torpedo quartermaster Grigory Vakulinchuk. They were organized, patient, and waiting for the right moment to strike. They believed a fleet-wide mutiny was possible, perhaps in the coming weeks. They had no idea their moment would arrive so soon, and it would be decided not by a grand political plan, but by a pot of soup. On June 27, 1905, the Potemkin was anchored off the coast of Tendra Spit, conducting gunnery trials. As was routine, the ship's cook and a few sailors went ashore to a nearby supply depot to procure provisions. There they purchased several sides of beef. The problem was, the meat was crawling with maggots. It was visibly, disgustingly rotten. The sailors who had to carry the foul-smelling carcasses back to the ship immediately protested. This wasn't just slightly off, it was putrid. But their complaints were dismissed. The meat was hung on the side of the ship, exposed to the sun, where the crew could see it and smell it all afternoon. The ship's cook, to his credit, refused to cook it. The simmering resentment among the crew was about to boil over. The ship's senior executive officer, Commander Ippolit Gilyarovsky, was a man known for his volatile temper and cruel discipline. He forced the cook to prepare borscht, the traditional beet soup from the maggot-infested meat. When the crew was called for dinner and saw the foul concoction, they collectively refused to eat it. This was their line in the sand. They would endure the beatings, the insults, and the pointless war, but they would not be forced to eat rotten food like dogs. The ship's captain, Evgeny Golikov, and Commander Gilyarovsky decided to make an example of the dissenters. The entire crew was summoned to the aft deck. Gilyarovsky demanded that anyone willing to eat the soup step forward. Only a few of the most timid sailors and petty officers moved. The rest stood firm, a sea of defiant faces. Enraged, Gilyarovsky ordered a canvas tarpaulin to be brought out, the naval signal for a summary execution by firing squad. He ordered the ship's marine guard to surround a group of about 30 sailors he identified as the ringleaders. His intention was clear. Either they would obey or they would be shot and thrown overboard. But Gilyarovsky had made a fatal miscalculation. He had pushed the crew too far. As the Marines raised their rifles, the moment stretched into an eternity. It was in this terrifying silence that Grigory Vakulenchuk, the revolutionary quartermaster, made his move. He turned to his fellow sailors and shouted, "Brothers, what are you waiting for? Take their rifles." The spell was broken. Chaos erupted. The sailors surged forward, overwhelming the guards and seizing their weapons. They broke into the ship's armory, grabbing rifles and bayonets. The mutiny, unplanned and spontaneous, had begun. The officers were caught completely by surprise. The carefully ordered world of the battleship dissolved into a blur of shouting, gunfire, and desperate struggles. Commander Gilyarovsky, fighting with a savage fury, shot and killed Grigory Vakulenchuk, the man who had sparked the uprising. The death of their martyred comrade only enraged the crew further. Led now by another militant sailor, a fiery man named Afanasy Matyushenko, the mutineers hunted down their officers. Gilyarovsky was cornered and thrown overboard. The ship's captain, the doctor who had declared the maggot-ridden meat perfectly fine, and 5 other officers were killed in the melee. The remaining officers were captured and locked in the brig. Within an hour, the mutiny was over. The sailors, shocked at their own actions, were in control of one of the most powerful weapons in the Black Sea. They lowered the imperial ensign of St. Andrew and, in its place, hoisted a plain red flag, the international symbol of socialist revolution. The battleship Potemkin had become a rogue state, a floating commune of revolutionaries, and its first order of business was to find a safe harbor. They set a course for the city of Odessa. Their choice of destination was no accident. Odessa, a bustling, cosmopolitan port city, was already a powder keg. It was in the throes of a general strike, with workers battling police and Cossack troops in the streets. The city was seething with the same anti-Tsarist anger that had exploded on the Potemkin. When the battleship, flying its ominous red flag, steamed into Odessa harbor on the morning of June 28th, it was greeted with a mixture of awe and excitement. To the striking workers and citizens of Odessa, it was a miracle. It was as if their revolution had suddenly grown 12-inch guns. The mutineers' first act was to honor their fallen leader. They brought Grigory Vakulenchuk's body ashore and laid it in a tent at the base of a giant staircase that led from the city down to the port. A simple note was pinned to his chest. "This is the body of Grigory Vakulenchuk, killed by the senior officer of the battleship Prince Potemkin for having told the truth. He died for the people." Thousands of citizens poured into the harbor to pay their respects. It became a massive, spontaneous anti-government rally. Speeches were made, revolutionary psalms were sung, and food and supplies were ferried out to the Potemkin. The mutineers had found the allies they were looking for. However, this alliance was built on a foundation of chaotic emotion rather than strategy. Matyushenko and the ship's committee failed to establish a clear plan with the revolutionaries on shore. They didn't land troops in force to seize the city, a move that might have turned the tide. They remained on their steel island, a powerful symbol, but an isolated one. The Tsar's authorities, however, were not idle. They saw the union of the rebellious city and the mutinous warship as an existential threat. They declared martial law and sent in the Cossacks, the empire's notoriously brutal mounted police. What followed was a night of terror. Troops fired indiscriminately into the crowds that had gathered in the port area. Buildings were set on fire. People fleeing the chaos were shot down or trampled. The port of Odessa became a killing field. From the deck of the Potemkin, the sailors could only watch in horror as the city that had welcomed them was drowned in blood. In a gesture of retaliation and rage, they fired 2 shells from their main guns at the city. One landed harmlessly, but the other struck a theater where the Tsarist military leadership was believed to be meeting, killing several people. It was a futile act that did nothing to stop the slaughter on the ground. And it is here that we must address the most famous and most fictitious part of the Potemkin story. If you know anything about this mutiny, it is probably an image of soldiers in white summer tunics, marching relentlessly down a massive flight of steps, firing in volleys at a terrified crowd of men, women, and children. You picture a mother falling, her baby in a carriage bumping and rolling unattended down the stone stairs. This is the Odessa Steps massacre, one of the most iconic sequences in film history, and it never happened. The massacre in Odessa was real, and it was horrific, but it took place in the streets and squares around the port, not on the steps themselves. The entire sequence was the invention of a brilliant Soviet filmmaker named Sergei Eisenstein for his 1925 propaganda film, Battleship Potemkin. Eisenstein was tasked with creating a heroic national myth out of the 1905 revolution. He understood that a chaotic street battle was messy and confusing. He needed a clear, powerful, and emotionally devastating symbol of Tsarist brutality and innocent suffering. So he created one. He staged the massacre on the Grand Staircase, a perfect cinematic location for his drama. The scene was so masterfully shot, so emotionally powerful, that for decades audiences around the world accepted it as historical fact. It's a testament to the power of film that Eisenstein's fiction has almost completely replaced the historical reality. The truth is, the steps were largely a pathway for citizens to bring supplies and show support, not the site of a coordinated military atrocity. The real horror was just as bad, but it was far less poetic. Back on the ship, the news from St. Petersburg was grim. The Tsar was furious. He sent a simple order to the admirals of the Black Sea Fleet: find the Potemkin and sink it. 2 squadrons of loyalist battleships and cruisers were dispatched. For the crew of the Potemkin, this was the ultimate test. Their rebellion had been against their officers, but now they were faced with the terrifying prospect of fighting their own brothers, sailors just like them, on identical ships. Their fuel was low, their food was running out, and they were hopelessly outnumbered. Surrender or suicide seemed to be the only options. But Afanasy Matyushenko chose a third option: defiance. On the morning of June 30th, the lookouts on the Potemkin spotted the fleet approaching. Instead of running, Matyushenko gave a shocking order: steam directly towards them. He was gambling everything on a single belief, that the other sailors would not fire on their own. The Potemkin, alone, flying its bright red flag, sailed straight into the heart of the loyalist formation. On the decks of the fleet's flagships, admirals gave the order to open fire. Gunners stood by their loaded cannons. It was a moment of supreme tension that could have ended in a plume of smoke and twisted metal. And then, nothing happened. Across the fleet, an unspoken mutiny took hold. The sailors refused to fire. They lowered their guns. Crews cheered for the Potemkin as it passed. It was an astonishing victory of solidarity over discipline. The admirals were powerless. On one ship, the battleship Georgy Pobedonосец, the crew went a step further. They mutinied, arrested their officers, and joined the Potemkin. For a few glorious hours, the revolution had a navy of 2. But the victory was short-lived. The crew of the Georgy was less committed. They were soon persuaded by loyalist officers to surrender their ship, which they grounded on a shoal. The Potemkin was alone once more. Having stared down the entire fleet and won, the mutineers had nowhere to go. What followed was not a blaze of glory, but a slow, desperate search for survival. The Potemkin became a ghost ship, a pariah haunting the Black Sea. With coal and fresh water running perilously low, they sailed to the Romanian port of Constanța, hoping to be resupplied. The Romanians, nervous about angering Russia, refused them anything more than basic provisions, on the condition that they surrender. The Potemkin refused and left. They made a brief, desperate stop in the Russian port of Feodosia, but were driven away by shore batteries. The great revolutionary battleship was now just 1,000 starving men on a drifting steel cage. Defeated by logistics, they had no choice but to return to Constanza. On July 8, 1905, 11 days after the mutiny began, the adventure was over. The crew accepted Romania's offer of asylum. Before they left their vessel for the last time, they made sure the Tsar would not get his prized ship back in one piece. They went below deck and opened the seacocks, intending to scuttle the ship and send it to the bottom of the harbor. They then marched off into exile. The Romanians, however, managed to prevent the ship from sinking completely and eventually returned the slightly damaged battleship to the Russians. The Tsar, in an attempt to erase the shame, renamed it Panteleimon. The fate of the crew was varied and often tragic. Many remained in exile in Romania and across Europe. Some, lured by promises of amnesty, returned to Russia, where they were promptly arrested, tried, and either executed or sent to the brutal labor camps of Siberia. Matyushenko himself was captured in 1907 and hanged. A few managed to evade capture and live out their lives abroad. The very last survivor of the Potemkin mutiny was a man named Ivan Bischoff. He escaped and eventually settled in Ireland, where he founded a famous chain of fish and chip shops and lived to be 102 years old, passing away in 1987. The mutiny on the battleship Potemkin was, in military terms, a failure. It did not trigger the fleet-wide uprising the revolutionaries had hoped for, nor did it topple the Tsar. But its legacy was immense. It was a profound crack in the armor of the autocracy. The story of common sailors successfully defying their cruel officers and staring down an entire fleet was a powerful inspiration. It showed that the regime was not invincible. Along with other uprisings and strikes, it forced the Tsar to make political concessions, however temporary. It was, as Lenin would later call it, a dress rehearsal for the much larger and more successful revolutions of 1917. But the story we remember today is largely the one Eisenstein gave us. A story of clear heroes and villains, of operatic tragedy on a grand staircase. The real story is messier, more human, and in many ways more compelling. It's a story about the universal desire for dignity, about how a protest over something as simple as a meal can ignite a firestorm. It's a story of spontaneous courage, fatal hesitation, and the incredible, unpredictable power of brotherhood. The red flag may have only flown over the Potemkin for 11 days, but its shadow stretched for decades, a constant reminder that even the most powerful empires can be shaken by the collective will of those they seek to crush. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the real story of the Potemkin Mutiny. The line between history and myth can often be blurry, and it's fascinating to see how a real, gritty event can be transformed into a legendary symbol. What do you think is the most misunderstood event in military history? A story where the movie version has completely overshadowed the truth? Let us know in the comments below. We're always looking for the next piece of history to investigate. And if you enjoy separating fact from fiction and uncovering the incredible true stories behind the legends, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We have a lot more ground to cover, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.